Look at the weather.
It's beautiful here.
Non-stop rain.
Oh, man, it is a blazer out there.
It's cold and it's shivery.
It is cold.
Really coming down here.
I really enjoy your weather reports.
From the All Indiana Podcast Network, we're talking weather in a whole new way. From historical events to what's coming up, plus weather news, science, safety, fun facts, and more.
I like where this is going.
This is Weather Weekly. Weather Weekly with Wish TV Storm Track 8 meteorologist Marcus Bailey.
It is episode number 44 of Weather Weekly. Thank you so much for joining us here. I am your host, meteorologist Marcus Bailey from Wish TV in Indianapolis, Indiana. It is good to be with you. We got a good episode here for today, and we're going to kind of combine a couple of things, although I want to spend some time probably next week leading into the holiday week talking about what just happened here across our country and specifically the Midwest, and that was the severe weather outbreak that happened on the 10th and the 11th. And my next guest is going to be coming up, and I'll introduce to him here in a little bit. We've been previewing the winter weather outlook, obviously, but we're going to spend a little bit of time kind of rehashing what happened on Friday and Saturday because of its historical significance. But we don't want to dive in deep because there's still a lot going on in terms of dissecting. And so, of course, that kind of brings it up here to the weather headlines. I want to first start locally. Obviously, we know what happened nationally, and we're going to talk a little bit about that here coming up after the break. But locally, boy, yes, it was nasty. Some of the lines of storms, we had some trees down, we had some power lines down. There was minor structural damage around central Indiana. Numerous wind reports, but we got lucky compared to what happened to our south, and west. A lot of our power outages actually came with wind gusts that were to follow with the cold front that moved through Saturday morning. We had numbers into the 60s early Saturday morning. I know I was taking my son to basketball games. We had a double header, and the first one was at 8 o'clock in the morning. It was extremely mild. We were into the low 60s. It was very windy, and those games last about an hour. So about 2 hours later, 10 a.m., it was real cold, and it was blustery. We were already falling into the 40s, and we had wind gusts up to around that 40-mile-per-hour range. So it was a huge change in a very short period of time. So that was the cold front. Obviously, the big story is what happened, this tornado outbreak, a rare December tornado outbreak, which could be, we don't know yet, could be a record-setting tornado in terms of length on the ground. We do know that the same storm complex that really got going in Arkansas produced a tornado over 4 states. The big question mark is did it stay on the ground the entire time? And if it did, it could be a record-breaking tornado. But, that's kind of an afterthought as of right now. The main concern is, unfortunately, the death toll continues to rise as of, we're recording this on the 14th, up to 88 people. The death toll is up to 88, unfortunately, that we've lost. That number could continue to climb as recovery efforts now are ongoing in mainly Kentucky. I know that there were some casualties in Arkansas, but a lot of the hard-hit places, obviously, and the focal points are in Kentucky, Western Kentucky specifically. Mayfield is a lot of the images that you're seeing just, I don't know really how to put it into words. Unreal damage, catastrophic. It's just heartbreaking to look at. You're also seeing those kind of images, not as bad, but unfortunately there's been some fatalities reported in Bowling Green, Kentucky. That's home of Western Kentucky University. And obviously just on the outskirts of St. Louis, there's the big Amazon factory where some people has died as well. So there's just a lot of trouble spots that, a lot of people that are hurting from this, again, rare December and just a lot of things. And we're going to ask Mike about this coming up. But, obviously the magnitude, the sheer size of the tornadoes, and we don't know still the kind of finality of the ratings of all of these tornadoes. But the sheer strength, I think, obviously plays a huge role in this. And I think also the time that this happened, it was late night on a Friday night heading into a Saturday morning. And it's the month of December. And a lot of people aren't thinking severe weather in the month of December in the Midwest. So we're going to be asking some of these questions. But again, obviously, it's just a really very sad situation that unfolded here over the weekend, and historic, and something that's going to be researched probably for a long time in the meteorological world. So that's kind of the headline here. Very somber. And again, we're going to kind of carry this over after the break. We're going to spend a lot of time on the winter weather forecast as we start looking ahead to the winter months. We're gearing up toward the holiday season and beyond. Really haven't tapped into much of that here yet this season. We're going to ask Mike Ryan from the National Weather Service, meteorologist there, senior meteorologist there, about his winter weather forecast. We're also going to talk a lot about this historic tornado outbreak that just took place. That's coming up next year on Weather Weekly.
Audible's romance collection has something to satisfy every side of you. When it comes to what kind of romance you're into, you don't have to choose just one. Fancy a dalliance with a duke, or maybe a steamy billionaire. You could find a book boyfriend in the city and another one tearing it up on the hockey field. And if nothing on this earth satisfies, you can always find love in another realm. Discover modern rom-coms from authors like Lily Chu and Ali Hazelwood, the latest romantasy series from Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros, plus Regency favorites like Bridgerton and Outlander. And of course, all the really steamy stuff. Your first great love story is free when you sign up for a free 30-day trial at audible.com/Wondery. That's audible.com/Wondery.
It is episode number 44 of Weather Weekly. Good to have you along. We got a good one here, and we're going to kind of hit on two big subjects here. Originally, this was going to be the winter weather forecast, but in light of the events that took place at the end of last week with the historic tornado outbreak in December across the Midwest, I felt that this would also be a good time to talk about kind of both of those. And there is maybe a little bit of tying it in together as well. We have senior meteorologist with the National Weather Service in Indianapolis, Mike Ryan. Mike, good to have you along for your second stint here on Weather Weekly. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, good to be back, Marcus.
Okay, so let's go ahead and, I want to spend some time. You and I were talking before we actually started rolling here about, what happened on Friday night and Saturday with this historic, severe weather tornado outbreak. Kind of a rare event in itself that you have that kind of a significant severe weather event in December. But, this even exceeded that kind of wording, right?
It did. And I'll step your listeners back a little bit. Mm-hmm. The alarm bells were starting to go off 4 or 5 days ahead of the event on Friday. As we started to see some of the trends in the modeling, saw that we had a intensifying surface low pressure system moving out of the Central Plains, moving up into the Great Lakes. It was in that perfect location where areas to the south and east of the track we're going to have an abundance of warm, moist air coming up from the Gulf, essentially very unusual for this time of year, as you mentioned. And the setup, I think, was what was most concerning to meteorologists. I can speak for us at our office, our colleagues at other offices. Certainly, I think, you and I talked a little bit about it. It was raising alarm bells and red flags for the TV nets as well. The timing was the first big issue. Mm-hmm. Became pretty clear that we were going to be dealing with this at its peak during the evening and overnight on Friday. And that's problematic to begin with. A nighttime severe weather event, particularly when you've got the potential for not just damaging winds, but tornadoes, it creates an additional layer of messaging that you really have to focus on to kind of alert the public of the dangers of the threats. It's dark, you can't see what's coming, mm-hmm. and a lot of people are sleeping at that time of the night. Mm-hmm. That was number one. You mentioned number two. So unusual to see this kind of a severe weather event in mid-December. So we've got middle of the night, mid-December, and you mentioned off air, a Friday night, 2 Fridays before Christmas, 3 Fridays before Christmas. Mm-hmm. So people aren't thinking about this potential. And that was why we really made such an effort to try and message this up here. And thankfully, we didn't see quite the instability in the air mass work its way up into Indiana, which largely spared us from what occurred further south down in the Tennessee and lower Ohio valleys. Mm-hmm. But yeah, when this is all said and done, this is a historic outbreak. I don't know if we have much of anything in the database to look back at that matches what we saw here. There was a December tornado event in 1957 that impacted, I believe it was Missouri, Illinois, and southwest Indiana, and there were a couple of large tornadoes in southern Illinois. But outside of that, I don't know if there's anything that stands out. And again, I don't think that event occurred in the middle of the night like this one did. I think it was during the day.
Well, I think to that point, and I think the question, that I often get asked, because, we hammer home so much during the, quote unquote severe weather months. I always want to make a point that there's never been a month in Indiana where we have not had a tornado, right? There's always been, there's been one that's recorded. It can happen any time of year, but obviously there is a peak season, and a lot of the people within my newsroom that may not have a deep background in meteorology, but at least listen to us enough. They say, oh, well, you lose a lot of instability at night and that kind of stuff. So even if this were to happen in the spring or summer, this is unusual because is it one of those cases, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but is it one of those cases that you had so much ingredients, I guess, for lack of a better term, that were so overwhelmingly high that it didn't matter what time of day it was going to be, that this was going to be a horrible setup, right?
Yeah, that's a big thing. I mean, one thing we talk about, the setups that produce severe weather and tornado outbreaks in May are completely different than what we have in the cool season or winter. Case in point, you don't need a lot of instability this time of year to produce impactful severe weather.
Right.
It's not unlike, it's a lot unlike what you have in the spring and summer, where you have a warm, humid day, that instability builds up, the energy releases, and that helps to fuel those thunderstorms that produce severe weather. In the wintertime, because of the differences in temperature in the air masses from hot to cold, or I guess in this case, from really warm, we were in the 60s and even 70s down in lower Ohio Valley on Friday. But if you went up towards the upper Midwest, the northern plains, it's in the teens and 20s. That's quite an extensive temperature difference that you're not going to see in the summertime.
Right.
And you just can't build up a ton of instability when you have that. But what you have is the modifying ingredient, if you will, is you have more shear, more wind shear in the atmosphere. And that helps to basically modify with the amount of shear in the atmosphere. You don't need a lot of instability to produce severe weather. Now, typically in the wintertime, we have an ingredient that we call CAPE, convective available potential energy. And in the wintertime, I've seen 300 to 500 joules per kilogram, that's what the measurement is, of CAPE be more than enough to generate impactful severe weather. We had in the lower Tennessee, Ohio valleys on Friday night, I think we had 1,000 to nearly 2,000 down there for a while. So that just gives you an idea. We had a lot more instability than we tend to see in these events. And, oh, by the way, we had very high levels of shear. And when we talk shear, that's winds increasing with height and winds turning in a clockwise manner with height. So the more of that you have, the better the chance to have thunderstorms that develop with rotating updrafts, which is a precursor to storms that can produce tornadoes.
And obviously that was, stronger with all the ingredients, just to our south, but it was a wide range, as you were kind of mentioning, that everybody kind of had to be on guard. So take me through this, because this is such an unusual event, and we won't know. I mean, they're still conducting surveys, and I'm gonna ask you about that because I know that you've been a part of that before, and what is kind of going on. But first, it's this obviously was a very large tornado for a very, very long time, and what could be record-setting in terms of distance. How does that hold together like it did? Because a lot of times, these storms, they kind of ebb and flow and they'll lift. And I mean, this one just didn't seem like, if it lifted, it didn't lift for very long, right?
Right. And, well, I'll give you an example, Marcus, of something I saw on Friday evening. I was at home after kind of working during the day Friday, and my group, that worked the shift on Friday during the day set the table for Friday evening, Friday night for our meteorologists that were working. And so I was at home Friday evening, but certainly aware of what was going on. step back with the main supercell we're talking about. There were several supercell thunderstorms that produced tornadoes. The main one is the one that was the long track developed out near Little Rock, Arkansas, moved northeast through the Missouri boot heel into northwest Tennessee, and finally across western and central Kentucky before a weekend. I saw it for the first time when I sat down on Friday evening. I think it was in the Missouri boot heel. And there were chasers out there that even in the dark were getting pictures through lightning flashes of what looked like a large tornado. So we knew it was significant. The radar data that we look at, the reflectivity and velocity was incredibly impressive. Had that very, very intense hook, the sharp delineation that we talk about with reflectivity, very, very strong couplet or rotational signature of inbound and outbound velocities that were noted where the tornado would be. And those are all things we look at. One thing that struck me, and I know it struck other meteorologists who were looking at it, that kind of raised my alarm bells is, oh boy, we may be dealing with something rather significant here for an extended period. The fuel source, if you will, for a supercell thunderstorm is the inflow into the storm, the warm feet of air into that storm. And typically that comes from the south or southeast of the storm. A lot of times when we're dealing with this type of weather, if you get showers or thunderstorms that develop to the southeast of let's say a significant supercell, that in effect can disrupt that fuel source. If you have, let's say, a thunderstorm that develops off to the southeast of the storm itself, of the main storm, the rain cooled air that's coming out of that storm can then be ingested into the main storm, or the main supercell, and it disrupts the energy and the intensity of the storm itself. We see that happen a lot. The thing that was so striking on Friday evening is there was nothing to the south and southeast of this significant supercell. There was absolutely nothing to disrupt it. And it was like, I don't see anything that's going to disrupt it. And it didn't. It wasn't until the storm got up into central Kentucky to the south of Louisville, where it had gotten further away from the better environment, the stronger instability, and there were showers and storms that began to develop, and some of that cooler air was getting ingested into the storm itself. That was what helped weaken the circulation. It still continued to rotate almost all the way to the Ohio River, to the southeast of Cincinnati, and it wasn't until it crossed the Ohio River and got into southern Ohio that it kind of completely lost its characteristics because it was so far away from the best fuel source, if you will. But that was something that I think enabled it to maintain its intensity for such a long time. There was nothing to disrupt it at all.
And that's not, I mean, that's something you can't unfortunately predict. You see it happen all the time with supercells that do form. But like you said, you usually will get some of these that fire and they kind of take over or whatever, they weaken the other one. That's tough to make a call and say, well, yeah, this one's going to be riding solo for, well, I mean, what was it? 4 hours, I think, that this thing was maybe on the ground, or that they were going through. It's unbelievable.
It was. And as you said, I mean, we need to let the surveyors do their work and determine whether it was in fact on the ground for in excess of 200 miles. I think that remains to be seen just yet. I do know that my colleagues down at the Paducah office, which I'm just going to give them a shout out because they and the Louisville NWS office both were phenomenal on Friday night with their warnings.
Yes.
And they've, the meteorologists from both offices have been out in the field now for 4 days straight because there's so much tornado damage to look at, and they're just doing a phenomenal job. But one thing that the Paducah office did confirm yesterday is that at least with the dominant supercell that we've been talking about, and that's the one that produced the damage in Mayfield and in Benton and in Dawson Springs, it does appear that one was on the ground continuously for 128 miles through their area. So we know it's on the ground for at least that long. They need to have the Weather Service officers from Louisville and Memphis determine if it continued on the ground prior to and beyond as well, and that'll give us a better feel for how long it was on the ground.
So take me through now. What is the process? Because obviously this is going to be a longer than normal process in terms of surveying, just because of, I'm sure, both sheer damage and the length of where the damage path is. Walk me through on kind of what you guys are doing when you get boots on the ground and you're kind of walking through to determine damage and rating and scale and all that stuff.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'll start with, I'll say, first of all, obviously, I have never surveyed a tornado anywhere close to the kind of damage that we're seeing down in Kentucky. Sure. And another. But, I like to kind of describe surveying tornado or wind damage as forensic meteorology. We're taking the radar data that we observed and had, and we're taking that out into the field and combining that with the type of damage that we see. How is the damage laid out? What kind of damage are we seeing? How intense is the damage?
Right.
That can vary based on how the structure is built. An above code structure will exhibit different kinds of damage than a structure that's poorly built, depending on the wind speed. Mm-hmm. And so we'll take all of that into account. We'll talk to people that experienced it. We'll get their feedback. Those are the three core things: the radar data, how the damage is laid out, and the degree of damage, and then talking to individuals that went through it and kind of taking their experiences into what we're seeing. And that's a process. It's a long process when we're dealing with a tornado that's on the ground for 3 or 4 miles. Sure. And producing damage maybe on the order of 80, 90 miles per hour, which would be an EF1. This is a whole different animal because of the amount of damage that's been caused. Because there's a potential and probably a likelihood that this gets rated as a high-end tornado on the EF scale. Obviously, we want to wait until the surveyors are done, but I think that's certainly a possibility. They need to be very careful going through, just very specific, going through all the data, going through different things, because the degrees of damage will be different in different areas.
Sure.
And this is also why, Paducah announced a couple of days ago that they were bringing in some outside individuals. And one of those individuals is Tim Marshall, who is one of the people that was behind the development of the enhanced Fujita scale 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
There's not anyone that has surveyed more high-end tornadoes than he has. And that's, again, very typical when we're looking at the potential of a high-end tornado. It's not uncommon for us at the Weather Service office locally to bring in other experts to give us a hand, because ultimately we want to find out everything that's going on. We want to make sure we don't miss anything. And so, I know there's been a lot of chatter on social media and other sources. Geez, they haven't come up with the data yet, the rating. It takes time.
Sure.
And this is something that's probably going to take maybe several more days before it's completed. And we just need to we need to let our folks do the work on the ground, talk to who they need to, look at all the damage, and basically determine based on the data they have. And some of the damage, we have all these damage indicators that we look at that has basis from structural engineers and wind engineers. So we can put wind speeds to it based on the type of damage that we see. Sure. And it's a very, very long scientific process, and we want to make sure we get it right. So
I guess, too, with that, and obviously, as you and I have mentioned with this off air, but the significance, and I think obviously what we've seen a lot on the news is the images out of Mayfield, which is just there's no other word than catastrophic, right? I mean, I don't know if I can recall in my recent memory anything that was close. I think maybe Joplin kind of rivals that a little bit.
Joplin, yeah, maybe Tuscaloosa in 2011 or more in 2013. I would agree with that.
I guess first I wanted to ask you, when you're dealing with such a long track, and maybe not necessarily the length, but this is a situation too, which kind of maybe goes to what you're saying. Yes, there's a lot to take in, but this is also being coordinated over at least 3 Weather Service offices, I would assume, correct? That you're kind of having to coordinate with your colleagues a little bit?
Yes, service offices, and actually there was a second supercell. That was the one that produced the tornado damage in Bowling Green, Kentucky, later on in the overnight. there's some thought, it hasn't been determined yet, but there's some thought that tornado originated near Fort Campbell and may have actually started on the Tennessee side of the border, which is technically Nashville's area. So you actually have 4 different Weather Service offices that are surveying, and we haven't even mentioned a couple of the tornadoes that occurred up near St. Louis. So that's office number 5.
Right.
And in Illinois, which is office number 6.
Right.
So,
yeah. Extreme.
Yeah, a lot of coordination going on, yes, yeah.
And so I'm sure that how does that end up working? Do you work up to your line basically, and so you just kind of coordinate on what they saw up to their line, and you see what's up to your line? Is that kind of how that works?
In most cases, that is how it works, and we coordinate really closely together. Mm-hmm. Now, there may be some situations because there's so much going on with all of the damage. I know, for instance, there was a smaller suspected tornado down in far southern Kentucky that, because Louisville is so engaged in the other potential tornadoes, the one near Bowling Green, the big supercell, which moved into their area to the southwest of Louisville. Nashville is actually crossing into their area, and their meteorologists are surveying that for them, the smaller tornado down there. So you're seeing a little bit of that as well. Okay. I think St. Louis and Lincoln were doing a little bit of that. It varies. I mean, we're here to help each other out. And in fact, on top of the teams that Paducah and Louisville, Memphis have out in the field, I know for one thing, we have a couple of our meteorologists sitting on standby here in Indianapolis that if they're called to help out, they're going to head down to Kentucky and offer a hand in the process. And that's not uncommon. I mean, we're one weather service.
Sure.
We're there to help each other out. So, I don't know if they'll be called down, but they're ready to go if they need to.
Well, and I guess it also goes to show, Mike, that, you guys and gals, you still have to, you have a forecast area where you still have to forecast for. You still have to leave bodies. The forecast doesn't stop just because there was a, historical weather event potentially.
Exactly. Yeah.
So one other thing before we kind of shift gears here, you and I were also talking about, there were some interesting radar signatures that you said you saw. Now, some of them that I saw floating around, I don't recall what the loft was, but I saw a lot of people just making a big reference on how high debris was getting shown being lofted within the radar. That was one of several things that I think was probably unique when you guys were probably studying the radar with this entire event, right?
Yeah, and Marcus, one product that we can look at while we're in radar operations, while we're warning, is we can look to see if in fact there is tornado debris. There's a signature that we can see, and then we can see how high it's being lofted. And typically studies have shown that if you can get tornado debris lofted to 15 to 20,000 feet above the ground, you're probably looking at a tornado with a strength on the order, that's likely producing EF2, maybe EF3 damage, sometimes higher than that. As you alluded to there were some signs that at times with this dominant supercell that produced the long track damage that we were seeing debris being lofted maybe as high as 30,000 feet, which is almost unheard of. Right. And I think it gives you an idea. I mean, I've seen some of the reports of people finding debris in southern Indiana, and eastern Kentucky, and that just gives you an idea of how far away it was lofted from the location. I know I think the report out of New Albany on the other side of Louisville, of the picture, and that was from Dawson Springs. Right. They determined, which was something like 130 miles away. That's crazy. The other thing I'll mention with the dominant supercell that I saw, I'll try to break this down into layman's terms for your listeners. There's a product we can look at in the reflectivity data that's called a three-body scatter spike. And it typically shows up with thunderstorms or supercells that are producing large hail. And the size of the hail, as it's reflected by the radar, creates this spike in the reflectivity. And the larger the spike typically means the larger the hail likely is. Right before the supercell got to Mayfield, for a number of scans, we saw a really large three-body scatter spike show up. Now, there may have been a little bit of hail within that storm, but it wasn't significant if it was there based on other things we were looking at. And it became apparent that the three-body scatter spike was a result of the debris being lofted. And debris signature, which is something, I've been a meteorologist for almost 25 years now. I've never seen that before with a supercell. And I think probably highlights, again, how intense of a storm it was, how much debris was getting lofted into the air, how large that debris was, and that's the signature we were getting. And by the way, with that, the ability to look at the tornado debris, typically that'll get blown out in the storm out ahead of the rotation and where the tornado would be. With this storm at times, it was getting pulled back into the rotation and probably pulled back into the tornado, which again is indicative of a likely intense high-end tornado. And again, something I don't know if I've seen really at all before. And I think that just highlights just how intense we're going to find that this tornado was. It's a historical event that we're going to be talking about for years to come.
Yep.
There's going to be research done on this.
Yep.
And before we kind of shift gears, because I know you wanted to do that, and maybe this is something you and I can just briefly chat on.
Sure.
The messaging, as we talked about, was on point. We were talking about this for days in advance.
Right.
We highlighted the risks. For instance, here in Indianapolis, we were doing conference calls with our emergency management partners, media partners. They were doing likewise at the other offices to our south. Once things got going, Paducah's warning operations, same with the other offices, were outstanding. There was lots of lead time ahead of these tornado warnings. Tornado emergencies were being issued in the case of the dominant supercell multiple times.
Sure.
When we issue those tornado emergencies, they don't happen often, and they're our highest level of tornado warning. Basically, what that's saying is we have confirmation that we have a large damaging tornado on the ground. You need to take shelter immediately.
Right.
That was issued multiple times. Paducah even went so far as to issue a special weather statement while the supercell was back in northeast Arkansas, indicating, hey, over the next 2 hours, there is going to be a large thunderstorm, severe thunderstorm, likely producing severe weather and possibly a tornado moving into western Kentucky and impacting these counties and potentially these cities. You need to be aware of what's going on. Yet, even with all that messaging and doing everything, the challenge we have as meteorologists is there was still a large loss of property and life.
Yeah.
And I think that's yet another thing that we're going to be looking at from a research standpoint in the months and years to come. Because I know it's frustrating as a meteorologist. You sit there and you say, what else can we do? And I think what we're going to find, unfortunately, is in some of the worst areas like Mayfield, like Dawson Springs, if you were not in the basement, underground, or in some sort of a reinforced shelter, your chances of survival probably diminished greatly, even though you took shelter.
Right.
And unfortunately, some folks just don't have access to that kind of shelter, and that's just a sobering thought. It's something, I know for my colleagues that are down in the offices that were impacted and work these events, it's an emotional thing for them as well. The mental and emotional strain of working that event and knowing that you're having a damaging tornado that's likely causing loss of life and property while you're working it, and then being out in the field and seeing the impacts to our communities, just how significant this is. It's not to take away from the impacts to the people that lost loved ones, that lost their property. Certainly that's words cannot express enough just how sobering that is and how much your heart aches for those people. But, I think it kind of gets lost, for us in the meteorology community. It has an impact for our folks as well. And I know I've reached out to some of my colleagues at Paducah and just said, hey, are you guys doing okay?
Sure.
Just worrying about them. And I just wanted to mention that as well, because I think that's something, with the messaging that we're going to, again, be talking about in the months to come with, what else can we do in that situation? The warnings were great.
Sure.
But still had a lot of property loss and loss of life.
Well, and to your point, Mike, and I think, we're all communicators here, especially in 2021, TV and radio always was in the forefront of being the communicators. But now the Weather Service, you guys are on social media. You're getting out there. We're all kind of all together in trying to reach out. And I think sometimes, and I guess it's helped that I have a wife that may not be as interested and nerdy about weather as I am,
Yeah.
To kind of put it in perspective, while we bang that drum, as meteorologists, we know it's coming. We know how serious it is. But even in those cases, and I don't, there's no blame to go around.
No, not at all.
A lot of these people are just like, nah, it's just, I'm not saying that they write it off, but they've got their own life. Like I said to you off air, is a Friday night. If this were to happen in Indiana, Friday night is basketball night, right? People are going to high school basketball games. They're going out to dinner. Even with all of the warnings that we had and the wording, even as strong as it was, people are going to do what they're going to do, Right. And so, you don't want people to live in fear. And you're right. There is a fine line. And I think this unfortunately is a sobering wake-up call, but also in the same sense, as I'm trying to explain to my children these images that they're seeing, and they're like, why did that happen? And all this other stuff. I'm also trying to not scare them and be like, look, guys, tornadoes are rare in itself. And when they do happen, they are commonly EF0s, EF1s. They're not strong. So,
right.
We obviously, and you said this, we don't know what the rating of this would be but we assume it's going to be higher end. So EF3 or higher, that those are extremely rare. So they're the rarest of the rare, right? I mean, tornadoes are rare, and now these are exceptionally rare.
Exactly.
It's just tough to convey that message because that's the way I think a lot of people are also thinking about that too. And it's like, I guess it's like anything and it's not just weather related, it's anything bad. And when you talk and and there'll be social studies on this, I know there have been on other major events, but bad things are going to happen, but they usually don't happen to me kind of mentality. You know what I mean?
No, you're right. And there is that. And I mean, I think we've been fighting that for years, but that did seem to me, with many of the stories I've seen, that a lot of people took the precautions that we would want them to take.
Sure.
And some of those people still were injured. Some of those folks still lost their lives. And I think that speaks, unfortunately, to the high-end intensity of these tornadoes, and particularly that longer tornado. And I'm not sure what else we can do. I think that's not to say that we can't do more. I think as meteorologists, we have a servant personality. We have a servant focus. So we're always trying to figure out what else we can do to protect that life and property. That's our mission. It's in our mission statement in the Weather Service. But it's something that we've grappled with for years, and we're going to continue to grapple with. And it's frustrating when you see do everything you can as a meteorologist warning ahead of time. These people do everything they can and should to protect themselves ahead of a tornado, and we still see that loss of life and property. It's like you said, it's sobering.
It's tough, but I think it also opens the door to, sometimes I think as meteorologists, we say, we maybe think it's a lot on us, and it's our job to get that word out. But to your point, I think we have realized that it comes to a point that if you don't have that storm shelter, which most people don't,
No.
And not everybody has a basement. And I'd say a lot of new builds that pop up everywhere, it could be 50-50 in those neighborhoods, whether they have a basement or not. a lot of the damage that you see in Mayfield, these were all houses that were on slabs and there's nothing left. And
exactly.
So I think it's, now you have to kind of bring in, this goes a little bit beyond weather, but I think it's necessary that you have to start bringing in builders and not just for homes, but a lot of the fatalities, unfortunately, that happened were in two factories, one outside of St. Louis and then the one in Mayfield,
Right.
and so it wasn't just people that were in their home, but these were people that were just going on a work night kind of thing. And so, there's a lot there. I agree with you, and can there always be things that the weather world can improve on? Absolutely. But I think it's also time that you got to bring a lot of other people to the table to make sure people can get through events like this.
Yes. Well, and just kind of finish on the point, and I think it's probably this way even in these parts that were hit the hardest, like Western Kentucky and Northwest Tennessee, Northeast Arkansas. As you get further and further south in the country, along and east of the Mississippi, I think some of the ground structure as it is not terribly conducive for basements either.
Correct.
And I mean, we've run into this problem in the Southeast.
Yep.
There have been, events, whether they occur at night or not, where you've seen a larger loss of life because people have taken shelter where they can. Mm-hmm. The best place they can take shelter, you have one of these more intense tornadoes, and like you said, it maybe clears most of the slab, and so even if they took shelter in an interior room, which was their best option, their threat or their potential to survive or come away without a major injury is diminished, unfortunately. And so yeah, it's frustrating to see, not because we want to protect people, and they do the things they need to do to protect themselves, and we still have these things happen.
That's right.
And I'm not sure what the answers are, but know that we're continuing to see what we can do to try and find those answers.
We are talking with senior meteorologist Mike Ryan from the National Weather Service here in Indianapolis. We're going to kind of switch gears here. I mean, we wanted to spend a good deal of time on what happened last week, obviously, because it was a significant event. But originally, when I messaged Mike a couple weeks ago, Mike always prepared. We had him on one of our earlier podcasts last year. He is excellent at preparing seasonal forecasts for the winter and really kind of breaks it down. So, Mike, I want to go back a little bit first to kind of review briefly what happened last year, because there may be a little bit of similarities from gathering on your forecast from last year to this year, and how did everything play out for you and for us during the winter of 2020 and 2021? Well,
Marcus, I'll tell you, the winter last year played kind of to what we thought. We were, based on a lot of the data we looked at going into the winter, and that includes looking back at previous winters that share similar atmospheric conditions, falls that are similar going into the winter. And we had a feeling with it being a La Nina winter, and La Nina just means, where water is cooler than normal in the equatorial Pacific, and that tends to have impacts on where the storm track goes across North America and adjusts the frequency of the storm track in certain areas. But we felt that once that established, we were looking at a more active latter half of the winter, the second half of the winter, and the potential to see our best snow was probably going to be during that time frame. And that's what happened. We got to mid, and we had about a 4-week stretch where we had a lot of active weather. We had snow. We had mixed precipitation. We had some rainstorms as well when it was warmer. But our biggest snowstorm of the year last year was the one that occurred President's Day. And I think we had 7 to 10 inches roughly across the area.
Right.
And again, that was during that stretch where one thing we tend to see in La Nina winters, especially as we get into the latter half of the winter, is we tend to see the storm track align across the Ohio Valley with greater frequency. So that's going to automatically increase the potential for more active weather, wetter than normal conditions. And when you can get enough cold air to build down into the area, then you see the potential for wintry type weather and snow, and that's what occurred. Now, it stayed kind of cool and bounced up and down in March, and then we had that really late snowfall in April, that a couple of inches, and then from there we shifted gears. So we ended up pretty close to normal with snowfall last year. The thing that didn't come to pass is we thought it was going to be quite a bit wetter than normal, and it actually wasn't, which was interesting. But the temperatures were kind of what we expected they were going to do, and then the snowfall was, again, pretty close to normal for the winter here.
By the way, just a quick question. Because I know that a lot of during parts of last year, a lot of you guys and gals were still like either intermittently working from home because of COVID. Did you get a chance to drive out in the middle of that President's Day snow at all for work?
Actually, I was off that weekend, and I was off on President's Day. But
you lucky dog.
Yeah. Our staff needed some assistance. And one thing that's been great about, how COVID's kind of changed the game for our operations in the Weather Service, we're still running under, limited staffing at the office. Obviously, we can call in who we need to during significant events. And for instance, this past Friday, typically we have 2 people on a midnight shift. We had 6 for several hours in the office on Friday night. And that was, again, to make sure we had the proper staffing for the severe weather, and we did. But one thing that we've been able to do that COVID's kind of forced us to do is find ways to support operations at home. And that's been something that's been really, really helpful. And that night, for instance, the staff there needed some assistance. I couldn't get into the office, but I was more than happy to support operations from home, and that's what I did for a couple of hours. So it worked out really, really well in that regard. And that's not the only instance where we've tapped folks from home to kind of assist in operations.
And this is I'm not dogging on INDOT. I'm not dogging on the city of Indianapolis DPW at all, because the rates of snow that evening were pretty high, and so It was basically fighting a losing battle. But I'll say this: when I left work and the morning shift came in, so I waited until they came in. That was one of the worst drives, and I've lived in Indiana 35 out of the 40 years that I've been alive. That was one of the worst drives I think I've ever, and it's all interstate for me, nothing but. And that was one of the worst drives I think I've ever had in my entire life. There was just a ton of snow on the ground that day. And I think the other thing too is it had been a while. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but at least my memory serves correct. It'd been a while since we'd had a pretty good thump like that for snow around really most of central Indiana, right?
Yeah, I think it had been close to 3 years.
Okay.
At that point. So yeah, and you're right. And the rate of fall was the real problem from what I recall that late afternoon, evening. It was just coming down so hard that road crews couldn't keep up. And that was something we knew was going to happen. And again, it's a situation where you prep as much as you can, but Mother Nature has the last say, and it's sometimes you just have to wait until the rates slow down before you can catch up on that stuff. Okay,
so we're looking ahead. I mean, we're all, technically in the meteorological world, we're already in winter season. Let's look ahead to 2021, 2022. Obviously, we're unusual. We've been unusually mild for the most part here for the first half of December. We've obviously had some severe weather as well. How does the rest of kind of this month and really the rest of the winter kind of play out? How do you think?
Well, I'll tell you, Marcus. Let me step back to a month ago when we initially put out the outlook, and at that time, and for a couple weeks leading up to that point, there had been a pretty good signal of a potential stretch of colder, potentially potently colder air that looked like it was going to focus during the first half of December. As we got closer to when we did the outlook in early to mid-November, it looked like we were already on the cusp of moving into that point. And so it was like, okay, it looks like it's going to be maybe more the second half of November into early December. As it turned out, I think it was more the second half of November, and then we completely moderated and shifted gears here so far through the first half of December. The one thing that didn't happen that we thought might happen was that we could get a couple of storm systems that would set up and maybe provide us an early shot of some snow or wintry weather with the colder air in late November, and we just couldn't get that. It just didn't happen. And so that's why we just have not seen a lot of snow to this point. But we did have the colder stretch there in late November. As you said, we've shifted gears into a really mild pattern here so far in December. And in fact, here in Indianapolis, we're running about 6 degrees above normal so far month, which that's impressive.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, we're in another La Nina this year, and so already we're seeing these potent storms kick out of the central plains. You know, that was similar to the one we saw this past Friday that produced the severe weather. There's another one that's going to be coming out later today, Tuesday the 14th into Wednesday the 15th, but it's going to do so a little further to the north and west. So there is a threat for severe weather on the 15th. Over Iowa, northern Missouri, that area, not going to really impact our area here, and probably not going to see quite as intense a system as what we had late last week. But again, another very unusual pattern, and we're seeing these kind of shoot out these systems. It looks to me like we're going to stay relatively mild through maybe Christmas, maybe a little bit after, but there are some hints that we might shift gears into a more extensive, colder, near normal or colder than normal weather pattern by the last week of December, and maybe that kind of leads into early January. And so we'll have to see if we can get this storm track to kind of continue through the area with greater frequency. Maybe that opens the door to some potential for some snow or some wintry mixed precipitation events late this month and into early January. We'll have to see. I still think we're probably going to see some similarity to last year, where the more pronounced potential for winter weather and active weather is the second half of the winter, mainly mid to late January and into February. The signals are showing up there. So we'll have to see if that happens. And that also, there's potential as well. Again, with kind of a more frequent storm track to the Ohio Valley. If we don't have the cold air in place, then that precipitation likely falls as rain, or maybe we have rain and thunderstorms based on the specific track. And so the threat for wetter than normal conditions, and especially the threat for flooding, becomes greater. Now, I said earlier that didn't happen last year. I have a little bit more of a concern for that this year going into the early spring, because unlike last year where we were dry into the first half of the winter, we are not. We're wet this year. So if we can get into a wetter pattern later in the winter, that could create some problems in terms of high stream flow across the area, high water, standing in fields. And if we continue to have an active pattern as we go into the spring, then that would increase the risks not only for severe weather in the spring, but also for flooding in the Ohio Valley as well. That'll be something we'll have to monitor. But in a nutshell, I think we're going to see temperatures that are near, maybe slightly above normal when it's all said and done for the winter. By far, the thing we're most confident in is the potential for wetter than normal conditions when it's all said and done. That's a pretty strong signal in a La Nina type winter across this part of the country, and we see no reason to deviate from that this year based on what we've looked at.
I think it's important to note, and anytime people are like, hey, what's the winter looking like? And I'm like, well, typically we kind of, when you see these kind of setups, they're, you lean to warmer than average and wetter than, so it's just going to be wet. And I'm like, no. That doesn't mean warmer doesn't always necessarily mean you're going to be above freezing. And it doesn't mean that when the wetter conditions happen, that it's going to happen when it is warmer, right? I think case in point is last year. It just takes one system to knock out half of your snowfall total for the year, right?
Absolutely.
And that really kind of put us, because up into that point, we had kind of nickeled and dimed our way through the winter, but that was the one that kind of put us up to, okay, now we finally got, close to average for snowfall last year, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other misnomer people make when they see, we're saying, okay, we see a greater potential for wetter than normal conditions. We're not saying wetter than normal. We're saying greater potential for wetter than normal conditions. And when we're saying wetter than normal conditions, that doesn't always mean snowier than normal conditions.
That's right.
If you get into a stretch of really cold air, your snows tend to be drier. In a much colder air mass, you don't need as much moisture content in the atmosphere to produce impactful snows. So you can have situations where you have a lot of snow and you end up below normal in terms of precipitation. We've seen that go back to the 2013-2014 winter when we had the 52 inches of snow. In January, we had 30 inches of snow in January. It was our snowiest January on record. All right, or it might have been a little less than 30. I can't recall exactly. But that was well above normal for snowfall. But because it was so cold, the precipitation amounts ended up below normal for the month.
Right.
And it's because you just didn't need as much moisture in the air to produce the types of snows that created those high impacts. So that tends to be a misnomer, and that's something we always caution people on when we're talking about wetter than normal. Wetter than normal doesn't always mean normal. So
right. And I want to take a step back, and I lied. I've actually had on this podcast 3 times, but you may not have known about the second one because Tara was talking to you about the changes that were made with the averages. And the last time you and I talked about the winter weather forecast for last year, you had given some hints that you thought they were going to lean a certain way until they officially came out then again in the summer. But I think, and it always kind of played in the back of my head, and I'm reading some of the notes that you had when you were presenting this forecast to all of us here. It always seems to me, not always, but it seems in recent memory that, and I think judging by some of the averages, winter has been extremely slow to start. Am I wrong in saying that? In saying that, it seems like December seems to be much more quiet, at least as of late, compared to the mid or certainly the latter portions of our winters. Would I be correct in kind of broad brushing that a little bit?
No, I think that's a solid statement, and I would agree with that. And when we change the normals, and this happens every 10 years, we get a new set of normals. So up until through last year, and we were running on the 1981 to 2010 period, and then we switched to 1991 to 2020. One thing we've noticed over the last 10 years is just what you said there. For whatever reason, December is warmer than normal, and we're having a slower start into the winter. That being said, we are also tending to have a slower start into spring. So it's almost like it's shifted, instead of late November through early to mid-March, it's almost like we're dealing with it to some regard from mid to late December into early April.
Right.
The other thing I think that played a factor was in the 1980s, we had, I want to say, three Decembers that were extremely cold, and in a couple of cases produced quite a bit of snow. Some of your longtime listeners may remember December 1983 was exceptionally cold, and around Christmas time, much of the eastern part of the country was below zero. I remember being down in Florida as a 7-year-old visiting my grandma and grandpa, and they were dealing with freezes down there.
Oh, wow.
December of 89 was very similar in that regard. We lost that data because we shifted to the 1991 to 2020 period. So in losing that data, and also with some of the changes in the data we saw over the last 10 years, I think that led to some of the changes in the data. December ended up being the month that we saw average temperatures rise the most from the previous normals to these normals. I think it was about 1 degree to 1.5 degrees. Consequently, we saw some changes in the latter half of the winter and early spring, where we tended to see a little bit more in terms of snowfall in March and even into early April, and just some adjustments in the temperatures as well. So I think your comment there is certainly valid, and that's something we've noticed as well.
So kind of looking ahead, and I know you mentioned just kind of the summary of where you think temperatures and potential snowfall could end up once we're done with the season. Is there anything else that, because I remember probably the first time that I went to a meeting since I moved back to Indianapolis with you guys, and I forget what winter that was. There's been a lot that's happened since then, but I remember that there were some other kind of unique features. I think maybe that winter there was some weird blob of warmer water, off the Gulf of Alaska or something like that. I can't remember what it was, but it was unique. And I remember you bringing it up in attention, to all of us and saying that's something that could play a role because, all the focus, thanks to Chris Farley, is on La Nina or El Nino, but there are so many more mitigating factors that can play a role. It's not just, that one thing. Otherwise, long range forecasts like this would be easy. Are you seeing anything that kind of signals some other interesting, unique factors that are kind of playing into this forecast?
Maybe not as pronounced as the example you provided with kind of that block of warmer water. I'll say the forecast for me was more challenging this year than last year because there are a lot of variables in play, and we really couldn't find anything that was a perfect fit. In terms of a lot of the different things we look at, obviously El Nino, La Nina, whatever phase we're in, that plays a huge role. But we look at a lot of historical context, and it's not just winters that had that in previous years, but what was the fall doing in previous years? So I was looking, we had a very warm and wet fall, really up until the first week of November. It was exceptionally wet. I had trouble finding a previous fall that was like that with a La Nina setup. I really couldn't find one. Another thing we talked about is the development of the snow and ice pack, particularly over Siberia, was rather extensive, and it got going pretty fast in October. And one thing that was steering us towards that colder signal that ended up bringing us the colder air in the second half of November was if we can develop any sort of what we call cross-polar flow that allows that colder air that develops over the snowpack there in Siberia, if we can pull it across into Alaska and the Arctic region, northern Canada, and that could conceivably open the door to producing a trough in the upper levels that would help pull some of that colder air down into our area. And that happened to some extent, but not quite as extensive as what we were seeing. Now, it'll be interesting if we can see that organize again at some point here, whether it's later this month as we shift to colder air or at some point later in the winter. Typically, what we're looking for is seeing a ridge in the upper levels that develops in the Gulf of Alaska, because when that happens, that tends to create a downstream trough that opens the door for much colder air, polar air that's in the in Alaska and especially in northern and western Canada to just drop south and east into the eastern part of the country. So we'll see if that happens. And one thing, I tell folks is the upper levels of the atmosphere is very much like kind of the waves and troughs that you see in the ocean. And different atmospheric conditions and what we call teleconnection patterns help modulate that pattern. And when it's in certain states, that can create greater potential for colder and more unsettled conditions to work down into this part of the country. And at other times, it keeps that air bottled up well to our north, like what we're seeing now. And the majority of the wind flow is coming from the Pacific as opposed to out of the Northwest. So we're getting a much milder flow of air across this part of the country. And that's what's happening right now. So long story short, I don't know if there's anything necessarily specific that would point me towards playing a big factor at this point. I think there are a lot of different things that, if they play out in certain ways, could steer us in one direction. I know that's probably broader than your listeners are looking for, but it's a lot more subtle this winter. So I think La Nina will play a factor, maybe more so than it has in other years, and we'll just see how that shakes out.
Anytime you ever mention, the cold bottling up in Alaska, you referenced that, what was it, the 2012 winter when we had the record-breaking snow here?
13.
Yeah, that's right. So I was still in Illinois then, and it wasn't quite record-breaking snow for us. I think it was top 3 in Peoria, but it was certainly the coldest on record. And I just remember the significance of it because, and you referenced it being kind of drier because it was just like, this clipper after clipper after clipper, and it just piled on. It seemed like it was like a once a weekend thing. But I remember the cold and why it was so significant. I was trying to explain to my boss. He's like, why is it so ridiculously cold? And I was like, you've got this cold air that's coming in from, the Yukon, from Alaska, and there is nothing but snow. I mean, there was no dry land. It was all snow. And so you didn't have that air had a chance to modify it all. It just stayed like over a freezer basically from there to Illinois, and that's why it was just so as insanely cold as it was. But it just anytime somebody brings it up, I'm like, oh my gosh, that winter was brutal. But that was the one thing I remember. The snow was one thing, but the cold that followed and the winds were just awful.
That's where I will go ahead and throw out the term that's the catch term for everybody: polar vortex.
Yeah,
and again, I think there's a misunderstanding of what exactly the polar vortex is.
Mm-hmm.
It's up in the Arctic region every winter.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, what you want is a weaker polar vortex, because when it's weaker, you have a lot more of a wavier setup there in the upper levels, where you have dips and ridges. So you have ridges and troughs.
Right.
And what happens is, in the setup I described a few minutes ago, you get that colder air, and you get a piece of that that gets pulled down, and it gets down into our part of the country. That winter, we had that repeatedly getting pulled down into our area, and we just never could get out of the colder pattern for any extensive period of time. When you have a strong polar vortex, it's strong, and basically it's so strong that the pattern holds it where it typically lies in the Arctic.
Right.
So, people think, strong polar vortex is when it gets cold down here. No, it's actually when it's a weaker polar vortex.
Right.
It makes it a lot easier in the upper levels of the atmosphere for those pieces of colder air within the polar vortex to get pulled and cut off and pulled down into the mid-latitudes. And again, that's what happened that year, and we just haven't been able to do that with any sort of extensive ability really at all the last few winters.
And you know what? I'm fine with that.
If it happened this year, but we're not off to a great start there. So.
I'm all right. I love the snow to an extent, but I can do without the minus 30 wind chill.
Sure.
That I'm not with that. So, all right, Mike. If anybody wants to reach out to you on the social media, how can they get to you?
Well, we've got a couple different ways at our office. Certainly, follow us at U.S. National Weather Service, Indianapolis, Indiana on Facebook. On Twitter, we're at NWS Indianapolis, and we post tons of material every day, whether it's significant weather we're dealing with or it's a day like today where it's sunny and mild. Weather stories, graphics, interesting climate data. Anything, it's all there. We encourage you to follow us. And if you want to interact with us, it's a great way to interact with us. So we certainly encourage you to follow us that way. And there's the old-fashioned way of going to our website, which is just weather.gov/IND.
All right, I got one last question for you. I'm not trying to throw you under the bus here, and this is not me poking fun. You are an Ohio State graduate. Unfortunately, your Buckeyes did not make the Final Four.
Nope.
The college football playoff. But I wanted to ask you this because you and I both reside or work within the city of Indianapolis, and Indianapolis will be hosting the championship game. So I want your prediction. Who's playing in Indy in January for the title, and who do you think is going to win?
Well, I'm going to tell you, the possibilities none of them are very fathomable to me, because I am not a fan of the SEC teams, and I'm certainly not a fan of Michigan.
He said it out loud. He didn't say the team up north. I can't believe it.
Growing up in Columbus and then going to Ohio State, so I've been a fan and an alum.
Sure.
Michigan, it was bound to happen at some point, but I think, that being said, I can't believe I'm going to say this. I think Michigan's got a better chance against Georgia than a lot of teams or a lot of fans are giving giving them credit for. So I'm thinking maybe Michigan, Alabama. I don't think I'm really interested in seeing an all SEC final in Indianapolis.
No.
I would love to see Cincinnati because I'm a huge Luke Fickell fan. And he was, of course, played at Ohio State in the 90s. He was the defensive coordinator there for many years before he came to Cincinnati. I would love to see him give Alabama a fight and maybe even sneak in here because I think it'd be a great story. But right now I'm thinking probably Alabama-Michigan is what we're looking at.
Who do you think wins that one?
I don't know. And neither neither one of those is really palatable to me. Who wins? So I think I'm not going to say, but I do think Michigan could give Alabama a really good game. They've got a great defense, and they really, really gave us all sorts of problems.
Sure.
Arbor, and I think they've got the defense to challenge Alabama's offense as well.
Mike, an acceptable answer is, because we're all friends here, is I don't care.
That's right.
All right, this is senior meteorologist Mike Ryan. Mike, thank you so much for the time.
Absolutely, Marcus. I love being on the podcast. Look forward to the next time.
All right, here's a look at your forecast for the week of December 13th. And again, kind of a mild stretch here as this podcast drops on a Wednesday. Midweek temperatures are hovering around 60 degrees. There's some similarities to kind of what we had Friday and Saturday this past week, minus the severe weather threat, thankfully. But you do have a pretty strong cold front that's going to work its way in. Ahead of that, we're going to have some spotty showers for the day on Wednesday and more consistent rain as we head into Thursday as the cold front moves through. Also noting that the winds will pick up. We could have some gusty winds Wednesday night into Thursday in that range of maybe 30 to 40 plus mile per hour gusts. It's also going to turn colder. We're likely going to have that morning high temperature, and then our numbers are going to tail off through the afternoon. Kind of active heading into Friday and Saturday. Friday, a little bit of a light wintry mix possible. Numbers are into the mid 40s, low 40s then for Saturday with some scattered showers. And then we're just chilly and dry for the weekend, right around 37. It looks like we open the next week up quiet Monday and Tuesday with numbers right around that 40-degree mark, which is average for this time of year. The 6 to 10 day outlook kind of near normal with below average precipitation expected. The 8 to 14 day outlook, which basically will take us into that holiday week and slightly beyond. We're actually looking at above normal temperatures and above normal precipitation. As of right now, still a little ways to go. Not looking promising for a white Christmas. We'll see. You know, there's a lot that can change between now and then, and it only takes kind of one rogue day and some cold temperatures to try to get there. But as of right now, if you look kind of on a larger scale pattern, it may be tough to get there. So we'll keep an eye on that as we roll along here as we're almost done with 2021. Hard to believe. Appreciate you spending some time with us here. Hopefully you enjoyed the podcast. Love having senior meteorologist Mike Ryan from the Weather Service there. Just so much knowledge, not just with winter forecasts, but just weather in general. He's great to have on. Great follow on Twitter as well. I was watching him and his thoughts all along that tornado outbreak Friday night as, the Weather Service here in Indianapolis was making sure that we were on guard. We were right on that threshold of, just missing out on the real nasty stuff, but a very active night nonetheless. So my appreciation to Mike for spending some time on the podcast with us. My appreciation to you as well. Love to hear your feedback. You can email me anytime, marcus.bailey@wishtv.com. I'm also on social media, Marcus Bailey Weather on Facebook and at Marcus Bailey on both Twitter and Instagram. Hope you can join us next week for another great episode here of Weather Weekly, all part of the All Indiana Podcast Network.
Discover more from Storm Track 8 Weather and Wish TV. Online at wishtv.com and when you follow Wish TV on Facebook. Plus, be sure to check out more great podcasts from the All Indiana Podcast Network now at allindianapodcastnetwork.com.